Hello and welcome to the Novel Analyst Podcast. I'm Jed Hearn, and every episode I analyse a story to help you become a better writer. This episode is titled Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo. The Art of Setting Description. So Crooked Kingdom is the second in a duology set in Leigh Bardugo's Grisha universe, which is this awesome kind of grim fantasy, Tsar Russia inspired fantasy world. I think I've said fantasy twice then. Oh well, moving on. That's what happens when I don't write notes down for the book descriptions. And it is a fantastic novel. I've got to admit, the first novel in this duology, Six of Crows, left me feeling a little bit disappointed because of the cliffhanger ending. And because of that, I almost didn't pick up this book, which I'm analysing in this episode, Crooked Kingdom. But I read Crooked Kingdom recently, and it was 100% worth it. It just built upon the characters in Six of Crows in such an amazing way. Probably the best fiction book I've read so far this year. We are only a little bit into the year, so who knows, that might be beaten. But a fantastic novel with amazing characters. Was thinking about doing an episode on characters, but I think as amazing as the characters are, Bardugo's novel shows us something else which is really useful as writers, and that is setting descriptions. Because I know that this can be something that's difficult to do sometimes, and difficult to do in a way that actually improves the story. You know, it's all very well just to describe a setting so that you know how the characters are going to interact with it and move through it, but it's an art form to describe setting in a way that develops characters and that moves the plot forward and that creates conflict and creates tone. And that's what Bardugo does in Crooked Kingdom. So in this episode, I want to analyze a very specific passage from the novel, and you can find this passage online at novelanalyst.com. And there'll be a link to this in the show notes as well. So if you want to follow along and look at my annotations I made on the actual text while I describe this passage, feel more than free. So the passage that I'm going to analyze here to figure out why it's a good example of good setting descriptions and to try to pull some lessons out of it for you as a writer comes on page 190 of my edition of Crooked Kingdom. It's about a third of the way through the novel, and there's no spoilers here. Nothing major happens unless you count a spoiler as someone walking through a market and nothing really happening in this setting description. So there's no spoilers in this episode per se. That was a kind of extraneous per se thrown out there. Anyway, here's the passage. Quote. Oh, and also I should mention that Crooked Kingdom is told from the point of view of 6 main characters. And the main character whose point of view this chapter is told from is Nina, who is a Grisha, aka a magician with powers and stuff. So let's begin this passage. Once they were clear of Black Vale, they followed the canals northwest, slipping in with the boats heading to the morning markets near the Stadhall. The Ravkan embassy was at the edge of the government sector, tucked into a wide bend in the canal that backed on a broad thoroughfare. The thoroughfare had once been a marsh, but had been filled in and bricked over by a builder, who had intended to use the site for a large hotel and parade ground. He had run out of funds before construction could start. Now it was home to a teeming marketplace of wooden stalls and rolling carts that appeared every morning and vanished every evening when the Stadwatch patrolled. It was where refugees and visitors, new immigrants and old expatriates, came to find familiar faces and customs. The few cafes nearby served pelmeni and salted herring, and old men sat at the outdoor tables, sipping kvass and reading their Ravkan news sheets, weeks out of date. When Nina had first been stranded in Ketterdam, she had thought of seeking sanctuary at the embassy, but she was afraid that she'd be sent back home to where she was supposed to be serving in the Second Army. How could she possibly explain that she couldn't return to Ravka until she'd freed a virgin Druskiel she'd helped to imprison on false charges? After that, she'd rarely visited little Ravka. It was just too painful to walk these streets. There was so much like home, and so unlike home at the same time. Still, when she glimpsed the golden Landstov double eagle flying on its pale blue field, her heart leapt like a horse clearing a jump. The market reminded her of Oskurvo, the bustling town that had served as capital to West Ravka before the unification. The embroidered shawls and gleaming samovas, the scent of fresh lamb being cooked on a spit, the woven wool hats and battered tin icons glinting in the early morning sun. If she ignored the narrow church buildings with their gabled roofs, she could almost pretend she was home. A dangerous illusion. There was no safety to be had on these streets. So as you can tell, nothing really happened in that passage in terms of plot or dialogue or anything like that. And that doesn't matter because this is very much just setting up, pardon me, this is very much just setting up a place which may or may not be of importance to the story. And what's nice about this passage in particular is it is not just a generic, boring piece of setting description that purely exists to just establish the physical location of where they are. What this setting description extract does is it really helps to move the story forward in other ways. So yes, there might not be any action happening in the story, but it does characterize Nina, and it does characterize the setting of Ketterdam, which is the town where this story takes place, where Crooked Kingdom takes place. So I read out that whole extract just so you could get some context of what this was all about, and also so that you can kind of start thinking in your own mind what was good about it. I really like that description personally. Now I'm going to go through and analyze that more in depth, so you can kind of follow along with my thought process as to lessons that I think we can extract from this and use to make better setting descriptions in our own writing. So we'll go back to the very first sentence. Once they were clear of Blackvale, they followed the canals northwest. So this is a really good example of an excellent way to justify setting description, because it can just be a bit weird when characters just start, just are kind of in the middle of a setting. They're like, oh, I better look around and describe this setting to myself because I haven't been here before. No, not really a good example. Can come off as a bit convoluted. So what's nice here is by having movement, it's a great way to justify setting description and scene description, because the idea of journeying into this quote-unquote new space makes setting description feel natural. And I think it was Steve Lochran, Australian author of Gold Rush, which is this superhero novel, kind of like middle grade, really fun. He talked about using this technique with one of his scenes where he needed to get this exposition across. But it felt really stale if the characters were just sitting there back and forth, talking head style, saying, hey, didn't you know exposition? Oh, I didn't know exposition. Thanks for telling me exposition. Instead, what he did is he had the characters walk around this big ship that they were on at the time, and just by adding a bit of movement and a bit of kineticism, that was a kind of weird, wanky term I just threw in there. By adding a bit of movement to this purely expositional piece, it added this layer to it that made it feel natural. So walking and talking is kind of the classic example for this. And also think about how you can be using that progression into a new space to justify setting description. Moving on further through the extract, quote, the thoroughfare had once been a marsh, but had been filled in and bricked over by a builder who had intended to use this site for a large hotel and parade ground. He had run out of funds before constructions could start. Now it was home to a teeming marketplace. End quote. What's really nice about this bit here, and I think this is the necessary follow-up to just the face value description of a setting, is it creates this sense of history. And through this sense of history, through this sense that this is a place that has not been static, that has not just been, painted just before the actors have arrived at this stage set, it creates this improved sense of realism. Because, real cities, they have layers to them. They have buildings that were there that weren't there in the past. They have buildings in the past that aren't there now. They have people who remember it being a city with no skyscrapers, just this big town, and then now it's a city with skyscrapers. So it's really cool, and obviously this is not appropriate for all types of setting descriptions, but especially when your story takes place in sort of one key setting, and you really want to go in depth and really want to characterize this in the best three-dimensional way possible, it can be useful to think about the sense of history and, how this place has changed over time. Because sometimes a lot of fantasy world settings, actually just a lot of settings in general, can feel like they have basically just existed for that story. Like, they just exist for the 3 weeks that the book takes place. How were they before the book started? Even what's going to happen in the future? Maybe that'll let you know about things that are going to get constructed there so that you can sort of foreshadow that development. Even if you don't end up explaining this to the readers, it's creating that iceberg of knowledge for you as the writer, which means that when readers see the tip of that iceberg poking out above the water, they know you've done your homework and they get this sense that there's something bigger underneath it. This also brings me to my third point about why this bit of setting description is so effective, is this contrast between this idyllic hotel proposed for this site versus the shambling markets that are now occupying this site, that's really cool because it reflects the kind of gritty, dark, this isn't what you're going to expect tone of the overall story. This story is very much a kind of grimdark fantasy novel about this bunch of criminals, essentially, who pull off cons and heists and all other good things like that. I think the back cover copy for my copy here describes it as Ocean's 11 set in a Game of Thrones-esque world, which I think is a fantastic analogy for this because, yeah, it has kind of the sort of dark aesthetic of Game of Thrones. Not dark just for the sake of dark, but dark because it kind of contributes to the story and the setting and the characters, which I think is an important distinction. And then it also has this heist element to it, which is really cool as well. So what I'm getting at with this point here is that good setting descriptions link to the theme. And this comes additionally in the fourth point I have here, which follows on from this sentence here, so I will read it again. Quote, "Now it was home to a teeming marketplace of wooden stalls and rolling carts that appeared every morning and vanished every evening when the Stadwatch patrolled." So what we can see from this is similar to that point about looking at the layers of history in a setting. It's cool to look at how a place changes with time. So, maybe you look at that in terms of a season. I think the Harry Potter novels are a fantastic example of this. You get this wonderful progression through, every season of the year as the characters are at Hogwarts, and that kind of reflects the plot arc and the character arcs of that story, right? So you have them, sort of moving from summer to autumn to winter, back to spring, whatever. And it kind of like mirrors the progression of the story in a way that's cool. The technique for that, if you are a literary nerd like me, is called pathetic fallacy. Pathetic as in that was a pathetic effort, and fallacy as in, that's such a fallacy-filled argument. And basically it's where you kind of describe setting in a way that reflects a character's internal views. So, it's raining means character's sad. So the point I'm getting at there, that was a bit of a tangent down the literary sidetrack, is have a think about how a particular setting might change with time, or with season, or maybe if there's a different festival on or something like that. Next point number 5, and perhaps this is the most important aspect of setting and this is probably what elevates setting description from being a purely functional, you just got to have it in there so that your story doesn't take place in this vacuum white box. This is what elevates it from that to setting description that really moves the story forward in an interesting way and adds a lot of depth and complexity and three-dimensionalness, if that's a word, to your story and your characters. So I'll scroll down now, not really scrolling because I'm looking at a piece of paper, too addicted to technology here. Quote, "It was just too painful to walk these streets that was so much like home and so unlike home at the same time." So this is really nice because we've just had Nina describe this particular area of Ketterdam, and most authors would have probably left it at there. They would have just given you a description and moved on. What's cool with this is you have Leigh Bardugo describe the setting, and then you move into the character's specific interaction with the setting. So we kind of describe, what's here and that, and then we break into the second paragraph here, where it goes like this, quote, "When Nina had first been stranded in Ketterdam, she'd thought of seeking sanctuary at the embassy, blah, 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 blah. After that, she'd rarely visited Little Ravka. It was just too painful to walk these streets that were so much like home and so unlike home at the same time," end quote. So that's a really cool kind of structure that you can apply to setting descriptions. Give what's there. So, kind of imagine this as an objective camera photo of the scene, describe what's there, and then move that camera into the character's brain and think about how they have interacted with the setting. And what's nice here is that this is an excellent use of how setting can be used to characterize and develop the point of view of the narrator. So like I mentioned before, Crooked Kingdom has 6 point of view characters, and it's not a particularly long novel for what it is. So it's really important, as with every multi-point of view story, that each of those point of view characters have a distinctive voice, so that when you're reading their chapter, you know that it's, say, Nina speaking, and that it's not Kaz speaking, which is a different character, or Inej is another character as well. It's important that they have unique personalities. And setting is really useful for this, There's a great example that Brandon Sanderson gives in his university lectures, which are all available online on YouTube. I've linked to them before in episodes on Brandon Sanderson, how he talks about how you can use setting to develop characters. So for example, let's say you are describing a glass of water. If you're describing it from the point of view of a character who lives, say, in the desert where water is really rare, they might walk into the room, look at the glass of water and think, what the heck? Why has someone left this massively precious, valuable resource out in the open? Someone could steal this. Whereas someone else, perhaps just like someone who doesn't come from the desert and has plenty of water, will not even think about it, or maybe not even describe it in the first place. So we see that here. Not everyone would think, quote, it was just too painful to walk these streets that were so much like home and so unlike home at the same time, end quote. That's a way of using settings, to describe a character's reaction to it in a way that makes them unique or conveys their backstory. We also see an interesting further development of this in the very next line, the start of the next paragraph. Quote, still, when she glimpsed the golden Landstoff double eagle flying on its pale blue field, her heart leapt like a horse clearing a jump. End quote. So what we see here is this very, very nuanced use of setting to develop character, because it's pretty easy. Again, this is what I think makes Leigh Bardugo's story so fantastic, is the nuance and level of dimensions that she applies to craft in here. It's easy to just say, oh, this is the school. I hate the school. End setting description. Great, you've used setting to characterize your point of view narrator. However, what's cool here is the main character says, it's really painful to be here. However, it also kind of reminds me a bit of home. So this ties into one of the things that Robert McKee writes in his wonderful book Story, which I'm looking at on my desk right now. It's right next to Crooked Kingdom, where he mentions that internal conflict, in other words, contradiction within characters creates compelling characters. So someone who's angry all the time is less interesting than someone who's really angry all the time, but then with a certain subset of people is really calm and happy all the time. You want to know why there's that contradiction there. And I want to develop this point a bit more, this whole idea that setting is a great way to characterize. Because I want to look at two of the other point of view characters here. And they are Kaz, whose extract I'm going to read is from page 174, and Inej, whose extract is from page 148. So we'll start with Inej first, who is this, who is described in the story as the Wraith. She is this spy, this very acrobatic person who grew up in a circus basically, and scales buildings and sneaks around the town to get information on other people. Quote, after she'd been freed from the menagerie, Inej had wandered the streets of Ketterdam, trying to make sense of the city. She'd been overwhelmed by the noise and the crowds, certain that Tante Helene or one of her henchmen would catch her unawares and drag her back to the House of Exotics. But she'd known that if she was going to be useful to the dregs and earn her way out of her new contract, she couldn't let the strangeness of the clamour and cobblestones best her. We greet the unexpected visitor. She would have to learn the city. She always preferred to travel along the rooftops, out of sight, free from the shuffle of bodies. There, she felt most herself again, the girl who she'd once been, someone who hadn't had the sense to be afraid, who hadn't known what cruelty the world could offer. She'd gotten to know the gabled peaks and window boxes of the Zelverstraat, the gardens and wide boulevards of the embassy sector. She'd travelled far south to where the manufacturing district gave way to foul-smelling slaughterhouses and brining pits, hidden at the very outskirts of the city, where their offal could be sluiced into the swamp at Ketterdam's edge, and their stink was less likely to be sent wafting over the residential parts of town. The city had revealed its secrets to her almost shyly, in flashes of grandeur and squalor. End quote. So this is really nice because it does the kind of dual role of describing the geography of Ketterdam, and also, like with Nina's example, describing the character's reaction to it in a way that develops their backstory and their personality. So what's nice here is that it clearly shows that for Inej, she thinks of the city as a puzzle to explore. And through her exploration, the rooftops, which she uses to travel, because she doesn't like to, have contact with other people after her traumatic backstory experiences, which is a good example of characterization, the rooftops have become almost this refuge to her, this sanctuary to her, this escape to her. The city is her playground. Her interaction with it is more childlike and playful than the other characters, and partly that's because her interaction with it comes almost three-dimensionally. She's up on the rooftop, she's up on the heights, she's climbing things, it's really cool, and that gives you a different perspective on the city than the other characters who are normally, just like ants, just on the ground level of it. So we can see here, again, this idea that setting allows you to characterize. And to further develop this point, I want to read an extract from Kaz, who I would kind of argue is the main character of this. He's the ringleader of the crew. For me, he's probably the most interesting one just because he has so many contradictions running through his character, and that creates this unbelievable level of complexity and three-dimensionalness to him. So here's the extract from Kaz's part here. Quote, they couldn't intercept Haskell at the Slat. Van Eck would have been keeping the Dreg's headquarters under surveillance, and now there were probably Stadwatch swarming over it too. The thought of Stadwatch grunts searching his rooms, digging through his few belongings, sent fury prickling over Kaz's skin. The Slat wasn't much, but Kaz had converted it from a leaky squat to a place you could sleep off of Bender and lie low from the law without freezing your ass off in the winter or being bled by fleas in the summer. The Slat was his, no matter what Per Haskell thought. End quote. One of the things I didn't actually notice about this extract until I read it out loud then was, just the voice. How different the voice of Kaz is, a lot more focused on kind of physical pain and stuff here compared to Inedge's description, which is more, I would say, almost more lyrical and more sort of above and aloof of the world. So what's cool here is that unlike Inedge, who thinks of the city as a puzzle, unlike Nina, who thinks of the city as a painful reminder of what she can't have in some parts, Kaz thinks about the city and about places in relation to crime. He's wondering, how useful is a certain building or street or place in terms of pulling off a con or a heist or an attack? And this different relation to the setting, this different setting description, characterizes him as someone who is, fundamentally more obsessed with your crimes and, how he can exploit the physical environment like he exploits the people around him to get what he wants. So a lot of this episode has been talking about architecture and other, constructed physical settings. Just to kind of give my own interest in this, I'm an architecture student, so I nerd out about this kind of stuff. Probably one of the reasons why I really love Crooked Kingdom. But I think it's really useful to ask, why does architecture matter so much in stories? And to kind of explain this, there's a really good quote from Winston Churchill, who said, quote, "We shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us." End quote. In a story, buildings express character. The ways that a character describes them reflects their kind of biases and their view of the world. Likewise, buildings also influence character. For example, by creating conflict, affecting their actions, or making a character remember painful experiences in their backstory, like Nina does in that example I analysed earlier in the story. And if you're thinking that there's a lot of complexity to doing a good setting descriptions, you have a couple of things to pull off, which I will summarize in a second, don't feel overwhelmed. Here's some really kind of handy mental operating principles you can apply to settings. And like with everything I say, these are not rules. These are just suggestions. Take what's useful from them if you want. If you completely disagree and you can still make a good story from it, awesome. So number one, you don't need to know or describe everything. If you did, then your story would be a guidebook and not actually a story, and would probably be massive as well. Number two, you can add more description in later edits. So if you're like me, sometimes I get a bit hung up in first drafts because I'm trying to focus on big picture stuff like character and plot and themes and trying to make it all gel and work together. So it can be complicating to myself if I say, and I've got to add really good setting descriptions into this right now. No, doesn't have to be like that. Just write the bare bones, then layer on setting descriptions as you come back. Reading one of Joe Abercrombie's blog posts recently. If you're a long-time listener of this, you'll probably chuckle at my reference to Joe Abercrombie. Love him, one of my favorite writers. And he talks about how in the current novel he's working on, one of the things he does in his ending edits towards, like, say, the 4th and 5th draft, is he goes in and adds details about the weather, seasons, and stuff like that, just to bump up the realism a little bit. So if that's useful to you, don't worry about getting all the setting description down there in the first draft. You can come back in and layer on stuff as you revise it. And number 3, setting descriptions are less complicated than you think. One of the things Brandon Sanderson says in his online lecture series a lot is this whole idea that with setting and with world building in general, you probably only need to go deep into 1 or 2 things. So that might mean you go deep into the ecology, or it might mean you go deep into the religion, or it might mean you go deep into the politics, or it might mean you go deep into the, say, artistic productions of a certain place. And then if you go deep in that one aspect of story and really convey it well, in that one aspect of setting and really convey it well, readers are going to believe that you've gone equally deep when you just offhandedly mention other things, but don't actually dive deep into them. They'll be like, oh, I really trusted what you did with this one thing here. I'll probably trust what you did with this other thing that you just mentioned. I'll just assume you figured it out. And in the case of Leigh Bardugo's work, she has a really excellent quote from a Writer's Digest article, which I'll link to in the show notes, about how she approaches world building. It goes like this, quote, "The great challenge of world building is not building the world. You could build a world with maps and languages and all these things and still be missing something. It's releasing that information to the reader. The world building that really falls into place first is what I always describe as the sense of power, helping readers understand how power flows in the book. That could mean governmental power, personal power, magical power, whatever. But determining how power flows is going to determine how your characters behave on the page and what they're able or not able to do." End quote. So we see this focus on the world as an expression of power in Nina's extract in particular. We see a lot of focus on embassies, on governments, on heraldic symbols and procedures in this setting description. For example, how the soldiers, when they come along in their patrol, all the market sellers pack up their stuff because it's probably low-key illegal or whatever. Not that seems to stop anyone in Ketterdam. It's a crime-riddled city. And these are all things that show how power structures influence Ketterdam and influence the setting and influence the characters through doing that. So that's a really useful potential lens through to which look at setting descriptions in your own writing. Have a think about how setting descriptions are influenced by power. How does the power relationships in your world affect the setting? So in summary, just to revise, that sounds like a test. You're not getting tested on this, don't worry. Just to summarize those kind of 5 key lessons that we took out of the extract of Nina's, which I analyzed before. Number 1, movement justifies description. So if you are struggling to convey description in a way that's natural, maybe think about how you convey the characters walking through that and describing this new environment or old environment to the readers. Number 2, history improves realism. Don't just think about setting as this kind of one-dimensional, paper-thin, two-dimensional facade of a building or whatever, where it's like, oh, it's just existing for this story. That's not how things are in real life. Things have a past, things have a history, things have layers to them. Number 3, setting descriptions help express the theme. I think this is the big one, one of the big ones, actually. The character one is probably the big one. Because really everything in your story kind of expresses the theme. The theme is a bit like a fractal. It's a pattern that repeats itself down through every layer of the story. So, the theme is kind of apparent in the one-line synopsis of a book, and then it's also apparent in the way that a particular object is described in the book. In kind of like a book with an optimistic, upbeat theme, it's probably going to be described in maybe a playful way. And then in a book like this, which is dark and gritty, it'll probably be described in a way that lets you know how it would be best used to kill someone. Number 4, consider how a place changes with time. Sort of related to that history point, think about ways that seasons and festivals and the time of day might affect the place that your characters are. And it's useful with this as well. I didn't put this in my notes, but I'll chuck it in anyway. Fun bonuses. To think about the different sensory details. So it's easy with scene descriptions to think about What does it look like? Maybe what it sounds like. But also push yourself to think about, how it smells, how it feels to walk across the snow compared to the sand, compared to the hard cobblestones, or the feel of the humid air, or the feel of rain falling, or the feel of how dry the air is in the city. And then lastly as well, taste. This can be a bit hard to get across sometimes. You can't, maybe you can have your characters go around just licking everything they see so that readers can understand how it tastes. But, maybe if there's food related to the scene or whatever, it can be there. Or even things like if they're near the sea, the taste of salt on their tongue, that could be a way to kind of develop it and make readers go in the character's shoes a bit more. And then lastly, number 5, arguably the most important point, is that setting allows you to characterize. And by using setting to show clearly the differences in how different characters react to the same thing, or, what the different characters focus on by contrast, lets you define each character as a unique person with their own unique look on the world, their own unique biases, experiences, and personality. So to summarize this episode, which I know has turned out at a mammoth 30 minutes long, that's kind of crazy, and I've had a bit of a sick voice, so I hope that hasn't been too irritating for you. Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo is a fantastic novel that works on so many different levels. There's just, wonderful characters, an amazing gripping plot that keeps turning and twisting in ways you can't expect, and of course, fantastic setting. The town of Ketterdam, where it takes place, really feels like a character in its own. And as a kind of last key takeaway for you listening to this as a writer, or even just an interested reader, I think what makes Leigh Bardugo's Crooked Kingdom so good is in how she looked at a, fairly standard element of writing, setting. And now she could have said, alright, I'm just going to use setting to do the minimum required thing it needs to do. Let readers know where the characters are, let readers know kind of the logistics of, different heists and different fights, and things like that. However, she thought to herself, I'm doing a lot of projecting here. Maybe she didn't think that, but either way, this is what I think she thought. I should make that clear. She thought to herself, how can she get the biggest possible bang for her buck? How could she get, more than one thing out of this one element? So this resulted in the setting being used not just to describe the logistics of characters moving around and stuff, the kind of blocking elements of it, but setting is used to do other things. Setting is used to develop character, setting is used to develop plot, setting is used to reflect theme. And I think for you as a writer, that is a really useful way to be thinking about any element of story, whether it's, the setting description, whether it is plot, whether it is a particular character action, whether it's the format you're using, whatever it is. Think about how you can use one thing to do multiple things. Think about how you can use one scene to do the work of 4 scenes. Think about how you can do one thing that achieves multiple things at the same time. And if you can do that, which is a hard thing to do, and something that maybe is not something you can do in a first draft, but in the second draft, and third, and fourth, and fifth, and whatever, you can develop it. Think about how you can do multiple things with one thing, and that's how you can create complexity and layers and an aspect of three-dimensionalness to your work. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Novel Analyst podcast. I know this was a long one, which is a bit different to normal, but if you enjoyed this episode, let me know. Send me an email at jed.hearn1@gmail.com. I'd love to hear your thoughts, especially because this was an episode where I did a lot more of micro-analysis, reading out passages specifically from a book to analyze how an author did something in the small scale. If you like that kind of thing, and you can think of some books in particular that would be well suited to that sort of analysis, send me an email or send me a tweet at jedhearn, and I will be sure to respond to that. Thanks for listening, and I will see you next time.